I think we can go ahead and begin. Get everything in order here. Greetings and welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thanks very much for joining us on session 1.1 with a particular focus on the impact of COVID-19 on peace and conflict. A number of colleagues with us either on the line or perhaps also among the panelists might have been listening in on the morning session. So this particular subject has actually come out on a number of occasions in earlier sessions. No need to particularly recap that, but I think it's a good opportunity for a bit more of a deep dive into this particular subject with a very distinguished panel. My name is Samuel Rizka. I'm the head of conflict prevention, peace building, and responsive institutions at UNDP's Crisis Bureau, and I'll be moderating this panel. First of all, thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I had the pleasure of joining 2 years ago in Rome. That is amazing. Hopefully we'll come back to physical participation and presence and joining at some point as well. Nonetheless, this is what we have. I think part of the trade-off is that a lot more participants can join on these online discussions. A few quick things as we move ahead through the panel. We have another 1.5 hours, so we expect the presentations from our 5 panelists to last between 5 and 7 minutes each. There are some questions that they have already received, and they will be responding to those. There are another set of questions that they have seen that actually come from the registrations. The Q&A is open also for everyone to ask during or comment during the presentations as well. So so hopefully in 1.5 hours we'll be able to wrap all of that up. If you've been participating earlier and if you've been a part of the discussions around COVID-19 and the impact of crisis and conflict, you will probably find the following remarks very familiar to you. A few things. Some of the analysis that we've done in UNDP and in the UN system related to the socioeconomic assessments and socioeconomic response plans for COVID-19 indicate a few things that some might be familiar with. Highest rates of COVID-19 infections in many cases are found to be in the contexts with the highest burden of violence. Insurgency hasn't actually declined. In some spaces, it's actually gone up. Civic space is shrinking. Seems anecdotal, but we'll hear a little bit more from our panelists, perhaps some specifics. Social contracts are shrinking. Trust in government, in neighbor, that's also shrinking as well. Social cohesion is being stretched. The Secretary General's call to a ceasefire related to COVID had an initial interest and surge in the beginning, but largely after that has not been heeded to a great extent. Some state entities are grabbing space more and more, helping shrink civic space. Some non-state armed groups are using this diversion of security towards maybe pandemic or COVID-related issues to expand their own space. So everybody is grabbing space to a great extent. When we looked at around 50% of the 112 socioeconomic response plans that we have seen from 112 countries, so around 56 plans in UNDP, and particularly with the team that's working, the teams that are working on governance, rule of law, conflict prevention, gender, and leave no one behind, we found a few interesting things. So this is a little bit of research that comes from the past few months. We were looking specifically at what these socioeconomic plans have been saying about governance, prevention, gender equality, human rights, and justice. A few quick things, and then we go to the panelists directly as well. On the governance part, what we've seen in some of these socioeconomic response plans is that support to the governments in the delivery of a whole of society approach to COVID-19 was generally speaking strong. And there's an emphasis on the work of civil society, faith leaders, and the private sector. So there's a surge in energy around that. There seems to be some level of prioritization for digital governance and the promotion of information integrity. Hope we will hear a little bit more about that as well, given that physical space has shrunk, maybe digital space has opened up for good or for bad. But there is a less of a focus on accountability and transparency and anti-corruption. Also, some of this data coming from UN ODC. In the broadly speaking sphere of conflict prevention and peace building, there is some emphasis on social cohesion within the plans that we have seen. And most of those references relate to a vertical or a horizontal level, the vertical being maybe the social trust, social contract aspect, and then the horizontal being the social capital, social cohesion part. On gender equality and governance, although it is recognizable that there are gender impacts of COVID-19, in many cases, it is recognized that there are gendered impacts that are different. In 61% of the response plans that we've seen, women are recognized as leaders in decision-making within the response. This is not broadly speaking changing culture or society, but in these contexts, in these plans, within that particular response to COVID. On human rights, 70% of the response plans that we've seen include human rights as guiding principles, and 32% of those show that a human rights-based approach is recognized in the response plans as well. We didn't see, except for 30%, actually integrate human rights broadly speaking. So 30% didn't as well. Maybe in reference to what we will hear from Shahrazad as well. 48% of those included interventions to support national human rights institutions, strengthening positions and capacities for human rights defenders, and the work with civil society. Lastly, on rule of law, justice, access to justice. Around 50% of the response plans that we've seen included some support to the penal chain, and 41% included interventions to strengthen the judiciary's response to access to justice, particularly to the most marginalized. I stop here. This is a little bit too much information, numbers, etc., but just to contextualize the discussion. I'm very happy that we have a very distinguished panel with us, who will be answering or have asked to answer in their presentation the following sets of questions, broadly speaking. How has COVID-19 intersected with existing trends in conflict and insecurity, particularly in relation to governance? That's one question. What implications does this have for progress on SDG 16, particularly, and more broadly speaking, the 2030 agenda? Are there any particularly effective examples for building and sustaining peace during the pandemic? In what ways can good governance tackle both pre-existing inequalities and some of the causes of conflict and violence? And lastly, what are the most effective measures to prevent hate speech, harmful use of social media by a number of organizations in relation to the COVID pandemic, but broadly speaking, going beyond that? Our first panelist, Shahrazad Akbar, is the chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. Welcome, Shahrazad. You have the next 5 to 7 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Samuel. Greetings to everyone. I'm very honored to be part of this important discussion. Speaking about COVID-19 and its impact on peace and conflict in Afghanistan, I first want to start where we were before COVID-19 hit. Afghanistan, of course, in the past years, as you all know, over 20 years has been in conflict, and the violence was already very intense in early 2020. Additionally, we had we continue to have the country continued to struggle with poverty, which was then also impacted by COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns. The public health infrastructure is weak. We have every year millions of dollars going out of Afghanistan because people go to Pakistan and India for treatment. And the electricity infrastructure and the digital infrastructure is also relatively compared to the countries in the region. It was also in early 2020 when we started slowly hearing about the COVID, and then the government started taking measures to enforce lockdowns. We had an ongoing discussion around the peace process, and in September 2020 we started the intra-Afghan negotiations, or negotiations between the Afghan Republic and the Taliban. So this was the context which really heightened this sense of anxiety about COVID-19 in Afghanistan, particularly the issues around poverty and the weak public health infrastructure. Initially, when the lockdown was announced in May or June 2020, the most immediate impact was really an economic impact, because this country, most people are in the informal sector, and the hardest hit were the day laborers. We started getting more and more news of the day laborers suffering hunger, really increased new poverty. New extreme forms of poverty among the poorest of the poor, who could no longer work as day laborers and have an income, either in construction or other fields, or people who worked in other people's houses or in the offices. All of them were really disproportionately impacted by the lockdown. So as discussions around COVID-19 were going on, the government realized that they had to start an initiative to support the poorest of the poor. Initially there was an initiative to distribute bread and kind of basic food to the families that were hit the most. And some form of this initiative continued till even early this year. In terms of the public health impact of COVID-19, it's very hard to rely on the data in Afghanistan because a lot of people don't get tested. But just living here and looking around, anecdotally looking at different communities, different cities, the public health impact wasn't as grave as we saw in Iran or what we are seeing in India, meaning, the hospitals being overwhelmed, long lines of people waiting outside, cemeteries being. This is not something that we experience in Afghanistan. And of course, there was fertility due to COVID-19, and especially the older generation was really hit. But Afghanistan is a very young country. This may be part of the reason why the public health consequences weren't as dire. But there is a concern with what's going on in India. So there is a heightened sense of urgency and anxiety around the public health aspect of COVID-19, with as we are following the news from India. The impact in terms of the conflict, of course, the ceasefire did not happen in Afghanistan as well, except a short 7-day ceasefire in 2020, which was more related to the peace process. There was no ceasefire or reduction in violence related to 19. Unfortunately, the violence continued to take civilian lives, including civilian lives, and intensified this being more related to the peace process and withdrawal of international forces. In terms of the peace process, the two aspects that were impacted by the COVID-19, I think both the negotiations, but also here on the ground in Afghanistan. The negotiations, it really became a sort of excuse for keeping it very closed and inaccessible, because negotiations were happening in Doha, and we kept hearing of civil society delegations, women's rights delegations wanted to visit the site. One of the reasons that they were denied of visas was COVID-19. So it sort of really facilitated that exclusivity of the process and really kept the civil society and the women's rights movement, human rights movement from accessing the negotiations. We sent a delegation to Doha in December, but it took us a while to get the visa, and one of the key reasons was seen to be, or at least presented to us as the COVID-19 reason. Now that there are discussions about Turkey as well, we in the Commission, for instance, want to take victims to speak to both parties. And one of the reasons that we hear sometimes from co-conveners is also COVID-19 restrictions. which will, we are trying to keep the numbers small. So in that sense, it did impact the inclusivity of the process. It became one of the ways in which, one of the obstacles to inclusivity and broader presence of people at the site of negotiations to try to lobby or influence or demonstrate. And Afghanistan as well, of course, because of the violence, but also COVID-19, large gatherings were made very difficult and continue to be so physical, with physical presence. And this especially, I think, impacted provinces, engagement between capital and provinces, and the discussion really became more and more a cobble discussion, because also we don't have great infrastructure with internet and electricity in all provinces of Afghanistan, and some provinces that were already kept out of discussions started to feel even more isolated because they were not directly participating in some of these digital or virtual discussions that were happening around the Afghan peace process and the conflict. Of course, the violence is the key reason. I think it's clear for the fact that you don't see large gatherings, rallies, trying to influence the peace process. People have a lot to say, people have a lot to share, but with target killings and environment of violence, people are very hesitant to initiate such gatherings and assemblies. But COVID-19 has been part of the reason for organizations like us to also another reason for us to hesitate, in addition to violence, to assemble large groups of people and try to hear from them directly in person, or have them in our offices to provide a safe space for them to voice their opinions. We try to do this to the extent we can, but it's much more complicated now because of the COVID-19 situation. And I will end by saying that right now we have a vaccination campaign going on, and hopefully we will see many people taking part, but even the decisions made around how to who to prioritize in the vaccination because of the context of conflict here. The military and the security forces were one of the first groups that were prioritized by the Afghan government for vaccinations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahrazad, for pointing out a few really important issues, particularly in relation to spaces that have shrunk a little bit, spaces that have closed, or pretexts that were used to close some of these spaces as well. Look forward to hearing a little bit more during the session. We already have 2 or 3 quick comments that have come up in the Q&A as well. Next speaker, Claire Lockhart, Director of the Institute for State Effectiveness. Claire, over to you.
Thank you to the organizers for hosting this important and timely discussion. I'll start by recognizing, as others have, the scale and severity of the impact of COVID on governance in situations of conflict and fragility. And Sam and Shahrazad, you've already laid out the contours. I think the pandemic has laid bare the nature of the social compact and the strengths and weaknesses of governance across the world, and what my colleagues and I have called the governance gap. And of course, it intersects with other and accelerating trends, including climate and the shifting contours of demography and technology. And as we've heard, it's had a direct impact on health and loss of life, but also on poverty and ability for service delivery to reach especially excluded populations. And in this vacuum, we see criminal and violent networks expand and move forward, even as government in some places shrinks. I think as I was updating my research, I think in some sense we won't know the full extent of the impact, particularly because of the situation of data. And 65% of central statistics offices' headquarters have closed, and 96% have stopped or reduced face-to-face collection. So in some senses, it's quite hard to gain an accurate picture, although I think we can point to some of the trends. I also want to recognize, as the questions for this panel do, that there have been extraordinary examples of resilience and innovation, and particularly from the frontline public services and the communities in the health systems, in the education systems, and those keeping clean water and sanitation, keeping electricity, keeping essential services going on. And and in particular to CSOs and communities and community health workers, who often are the least well paid, but they're the ones in the community and have been able to respond in various ways. And I note one of the questions in the panel about this, that perhaps they've been overburdened, and how to get that balance of allocation of rights and responsibilities appropriately. And very inspiring examples, for example, from Sierra Leone, how they use the protocols developed under the Ebola crisis to be able to respond and keep schools and children safe in the pandemic. The Philippines, who adjusted their block grant program, the Guinea, who used CDD and repurposed delivery systems for delivery of medical kits. As we look to both continue to confront the pandemic, mitigate and prepare for recovery, especially in comfort and fragility, I think the Secretary General's call for renewed social compact and rebuilding trust in institutions is exactly the right call, and applies just as much in situations of conflict and fragility right across the spectrum. And pulling from my colleagues and my research in looking around the world at the state of the state in the COVID situation, but also on how countries across the world have responded to previous, both pandemic and other crises. I wanted just to highlight a few lessons to point towards. But one is that the themes and goals of SDG 16 remain absolutely critical, and that justice and fairness and non-discrimination should be at the center of peace building and conflict mitigation efforts, from addressing grievances and efforts to prevent conflict and mitigate conflict, right through to the peacemaking, the recovery and rebuilding. And I think in today's era, we have to question, as many do, the tendency for elite deals and focus on the center rather than citizen-centered approaches to peacemaking and peace building. The second is that justice and fairness and good governance, of course, applies. It's not a silo, and we have to get away from the siloed approaches. And of course, it applies just as much to how health services are delivered, how education services are restarted, how social protection networks reach people. So really call for an integrated approach that is epitomized by the SDG framework. The third is that often it's not a shortage of resources. And while the world community has mobilized, including through the IDA resources and additional IMF resources, often, as we know, it's not a shortage of resources, but it's a question of prioritization and sequencing. And my colleagues and I have been looking at a reform sequencing tracker to understand how these sequencing decisions are made, but how to prioritize, and how are the accountabilities set, so that those resources are stewarded in the public interest. And as the previous panels at this conference have mentioned, also the importance of the market building and restarting the economy in those prioritization frameworks. Then, and particularly with the social compact at the fore, the absolutely essential lesson to put citizens at the core of decision-making, of analysis, and a prioritization. And we've heard, and very worryingly, that civic space in many senses has closed or has shrunk. But as Sam, you mentioned that in some cases the civic space is shifting online, but also the role of not only civil society organizations, but the public communities and citizens in decision making. And while the international community has spent a lot of time on the compact between the international community and the government, I think in the recovery phase, again, particularly in fragile and conflict states, it's the compact between the government and the people, the social compact, that needs to come to the fore and be prioritized. And I think, and referencing one of the questions, the really important role of community-driven development and civic actors and communities in leading, in prioritizing, and then the decision-making on recovery is going to be central. And then a last and final point is that, and that it can't be business as usual. And as the world looks to the 1 and 2, 3 years ahead, that there have been so many principles, as we all know, adopted, and some of them are rightly reflected in the SDG 16 plus community statement. But there have been the commitments that were made at the World Humanitarian Summit, at Busan, and in the New Deal, we all know, and I think our community has absorbed the lessons of what must be done, but this does require then now not only signing up to these principles, but putting them into effect. And on the side of governments, a real commitment to the stewardship and accountability and resources. And on the side of the donors to implement these principles and implement the principles that we know are the right ones, including to let countries set their own priorities and create the space for them to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. All very well noted. Thanks also for reminding of a point that Charazad mentioned that I forgot to highlight as well, which is this link with, you know, a little bit more of the elite deals that are happening. Yet to a great example, COVID-19 was used in the case of Afghanistan to re-centralize, make things capital-based. And maybe an opportunity to alienate or push aside some others out in the provinces, etc. Also thanking you for reminding of some of the long-standing commitments, certainly since 2016 in the World Humanitarian Summit, of good stewardship, the humanitarian development peace nexus. Curiously enough, at the beginning of the COVID response, we started with a humanitarian plan, and we went to socioeconomic response plans, with the hope that some of the social cohesion, governance, etc. stuff would come out later. I think the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis was a great example of the irrelevance of sequencing, strict prioritization. Something starts, something happens in the next phase, etc. When everything, as you mentioned, was happening at the same time. The health crisis was happening. The socioeconomic impact was immediate and required some immediate responses as well. The governance work also required some work, but thank you also for pointing to some of the really good examples of using existing infrastructure from another crisis for this particular crisis. Moving quickly to Jennifer Smith, Executive Director of the International Legal Foundation. Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks, Sam, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here for this critically important conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen in criminal justice systems during COVID, and hopefully end on some hopeful, effective approaches that we've seen during this time. For 20 years, the International Legal Foundation has been on the front lines of the fight for equal access to justice in conflict-affected countries around the world. We were founded with the understanding that without justice, peace is not possible, and that throughout the world, criminal justice systems are the main source of human rights violations, including torture, arbitrary detention, and discrimination. 10 years ago, we may all remember that the World Bank's World Development Report identified weak institutions as the main predictor of whether violence and instability will occur or reoccur in a fragile country. When state institutions do not adequately protect their citizens, provide access to justice, or guard against corruption, the likelihood of violent conflict increases, they said. And what we found is that effective legal aid institutions are essential components of fair and balanced criminal justice systems. Legal aid advocates serve as a check on other branches of government. They ensure that laws are fully and fairly implemented and that every person is afforded due process of law. They also protect the accused from arbitrary detention and other abuses such as torture, corruption, and discrimination. But frankly, the problem in most countries of the world is that effective legal aid institutions don't exist. And we believe as an organization that quality legal aid services are an essential human right and the only way to ensure our goal of equal access to justice for all and peaceful and inclusive societies. And I just want to say, I'm really not overstating the fact when I say that a lack of access to effective legal aid services is a global crisis and that it's underaddressed in every country of the world. I know we're focusing on conflict, but really from the United States to Argentina, from South Africa to Afghanistan, from Tunisia to Myanmar, the poor are effectively shut out of their own justice systems because of a lack of access to legal aid. Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals provides an unprecedented opportunity to meaningfully address this crisis, but we really need to do more to ensure that governments understand that there is no meaningful access to justice for the poor without access to legal aid, and we must invest in ensuring this fundamental human right. COVID-19, we've seen, has only further highlighted the urgency of addressing this crisis and access to legal aid. As COVID spread around the world, court systems shut down, leaving citizens without any forum to address their urgent justice needs. Millions have been left to languish, and many have died in overcrowded, dangerous detention facilities. In Myanmar, 1 year into the pandemic, courts in many parts of the country are still closed, leaving detainees without any way of seeking release. And since the February 1st coup, the situation has worsened further. In many countries, police and security forces have also used the pandemic as a pretext for abuse. In Nepal, shortly after a strict stay-at-home order was announced last year, instances of police using violence and abuse to enforce lockdown measures began to surface. Often those targeted were those most marginalized in Nepal societies, including the Dalit community and indigenous communities and religious minorities. In Afghanistan, the pandemic, as we've heard from Shahrazad, uniquely impacted women and girls, and including those in the criminal justice system. Following high-level advocacy from us and many other partners in Afghanistan last spring, the Afghan government actually took positive steps to release more than 22,000 people from dangerous and overcrowded prisons. Among them were hundreds of women and girls. But the problem we saw pretty soon thereafter was that many women couldn't afford to pay the bail or fines that were being imposed, as many women in Afghanistan don't have access to their family's finances. And further, many of those who could be released didn't have a safe place to go because their husbands or other family members would harm them. In Tunisia, earlier this year, police arrested hundreds of people, mostly teenagers, in one of the cities in which we work for protesting their government against increasing poverty, corruption, and injustice. And I think we have to recognize that beyond the impact on these individuals who are in conflict with the law, the impact these injustices have on young girls and boys, on communities who grow up traumatized by discrimination and violence has. They live with the feeling that their existence is controlled by governments who don't care about their safety or their future. So while these are extraordinarily hard times, we do and we have seen reason for hope. And we have seen that COVID has shown in some countries around the world that it is possible to change our justice systems. As advocates, we believe we must not let things go back to the way they were, but to use this opportunity to reimagine the abusive laws that criminalize what should be non-criminal conduct and policies that prioritize pretrial detention, to create court systems that are more responsive to their communities and have honest conversations about the ways in which our justice systems are actively discriminating against those most marginalized in our communities. And just to hopefully spark some further conversation during the Q&A, just a few examples of some things we've seen. In Palestine early on, we saw that children were being arrested and detained for being outside during the curfew. We approached the Attorney General's office, the Ministry of Social Affairs, and got a joint agreement that children should not be detained for violating curfew orders. In Nepal, to address the police abuse that I mentioned earlier, our colleagues partnered with many other civil society organizations to bring a petition to the Supreme Court. They won that case, arguing that people were allowed to leave their homes for food and medicine, and that it was a violation of the Constitution for people in custody to be subjected to physical and mental torture or cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment by the police. In Afghanistan, recognizing the unique challenges facing formerly incarcerated women, we established, along with a number of other partners, an innovative reentry program with the goal to address their long-term needs. We worked with shelters and government agencies to ensure shelter access and transport for women upon their release, urgent family and civil law services, legal services, and made referrals to address their mental health and trauma-related needs. You know, I think importantly, this project has led to conversations about how the justice system in Afghanistan can better help break the cycle of violence in families and provide counseling to address the root causes. And finally, in Tunisia, we've been working to advance use of mediation to resolve criminal cases. I think this is a really exciting initiative because the goal is for the victim and the offender to resolve the conflict together and to really construct their own approach to achieving justice that allows them to express fully their feelings and perceptions, and to allow the offender to repair the harm and make things right. So I just want to, as a last point, echo what I saw Mr. Garcia Sayan, the Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers, say in the previous session. And that's that throughout this COVID crisis, one of the things he's seeing is that the work of legal aid lawyers has been further restricted and seen as not essential by governments. And this is creating a further crisis, because without strong legal aid lawyers, we risk serious injustices, abuse of power, mistrust of authorities, and lasting rifts in society. Thanks so much for allowing me to share these reflections.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Very important reflections. I think you just reminded us of the cascading problem of COVID. We started with a humanitarian health problem, and there's a socioeconomic problem. And then I think some of us tended to forget that, the closure of civic space ended up being closure of institutions. So if you don't have access to justice, courts, police, etc., then I think there really is a problem, and that in some cases, the positive cases that you mentioned, because of advocacy, some of the decisions were actually reversed because of that as well. Also, thank you for linking some of this to ongoing and standing advocacy points and human rights points, including things related to transitional justice, restorative justice, that in some communities, these needs didn't go away because of COVID. In many cases, the opportunity of COVID is an important point to bring some of those back. So thanks very much. Thanks also to Chris, who will be not the next speaker, but the one after, for already starting to respond to some of the questions that are coming online as well. So much appreciated. Our next speaker, Liv Velatson, is the Deputy Director of UNICRI, the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute. Liv, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. So yes, my name is Liv Velatson, Deputy Director of UNICRI. So thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity on behalf of the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, UNICRI, this opportunity to speak during this session on impact of the pandemic on peace and conflict during the SDG 16 conference. As you probably are aware, mandated to work in this field of criminal justice, crime prevention, counter-terrorism, UNICRI's current priorities, of course, are particularly aligned with SDG 16 and the topic of today, when applying, using our tools and expertise related to our research, delivery of training, capacity building, technical assistance, policy support to governments and non-state actors. I think being a cross-cutting issue, the topic of today on peace and conflict, also during the pandemic, is reflected in most of our strategic priorities and work, and particularly in relation to our work on preventing and countering violent extremism, countering organized crime, and reinforcing the rule of law in conflict and post-conflict countries. But let me give you one example of where UNICRI in particular has been focusing on this topic, namely in our work in the Sahel-Maghreb region. And of course, as you probably are aware, violent extremism remains a persistent threat to peace and stability in the Sahel-Maghreb region. More than nearly at least 6,000 people have lost their lives in ongoing conflicts between 2015 and 2020 in this region. In particular, the Sahel region was particularly badly hit, with Burkina Faso and Mali seeing a marked increase in their attacks since 2018. And also the Maghreb region, many youths were radicalized and left their countries to join the ranks of foreign terrorist fighters. So in this context, UNICRI has since 2015 worked with governments, non-state actors to prevent violent extremism and radicalization, in particular among young people, or including also during the pandemic. All in all, this has included support for more than 80 non-state actors, while engaging more than 22,000 people from communities mostly affected by or at risk of radicalization to violent extremism and conflict in general. And feeding into our programs, into our policies and concrete intervention, UNICRI has also conducted a number of research studies in this region to better understand the impact that the long-standing presence of terrorist groups has produced on the daily lives of young people, on the reasons behind the spread of extremism, violence, and try to find an answer, at least attempting, to the question of what motivates people, often young people, to join violent extremist group in the Sahel and Maghreb region, and how to best support the empowerment of young people to enhance their resilience and to build their capacities in the various fields, including during the pandemic. Our research, one of the research, based on the perspectives and perception of the grassroots organization and local communities, try to analyze the root causes, what we consider as the root causes of ongoing conflicts, violent incidents, and community tensions in this region. And based on the analysis of the data collected, the grievances, objective or perceived, that was reported as pushing factors towards the radicalization and violent extremism, basically relate to 9 macro areas relating to good governance, security, rule of law, education, economy, environment, social justice, culture, and religion. Well, not surprisingly. But as you can see, the perceived grievances are predominantly structural in nature and require some kind of developmental approach. So I think the SDG 16, of course, will focus on access to justice for all and building accountable and inclusive institutions at all levels, of course, appears particularly relevant here. Another study focusing particularly on Mali also concluded, and again, not surprisingly, that engagement into violence and perceived support for jihadist groups, violent extremist groups, are very much linked to the contextual situation. For instance, perceived levels of support for violent extremism in the Menaka region in Mali tells us that the long-standing feelings of neglect by the central states has likely made the north of Mali much more open to, or at least more vulnerable to, extremist group, which has also been used during the pandemic, of course. So these groups, who frequently provide some basic services and or fill other quasi-governmental roles, are able and were able to gain traction where the state has long been absent. So using this finding from our research, let me just give you a few examples of what UNICRI has been doing to address or prevent engagement into violent extremism, and how we work with local communities to identify responses to extremism and its narratives, also during the pandemic. For instance, UNICRI is working closely with local, international NGOs, non-state actors, to organize engagement and empowerment training sessions targeting to young people to promote alternatives to violence, covering topics related to media literacy, counter discourse, alternative narratives, communication and public speaking, conflict prevention and management, political skills and spaces for political debate, just to mention a few. UNICRI also has continued to engage with youth in our empowerment mentoring programs, which connected a selection of young leaders with respected individuals from the national and international communities who acted as personal and professional mentors. And here the aim was, and still is, to enable young leaders to grow and professionalize their leadership skills, and thereby to increase the local impact of the efforts to build peace and resilience against violent extremism. We also continue these activities during the pandemic. In parallel, and also continued during the pandemic, UNICRI were also working with and supported the prison authorities in this region in developing rehabilitation and reintegration programs into proven management of violent extremist offenders. So these are just few among many, I think, successful examples of our work in the region, including during the pandemic. Finally, just allow me just to say a few words on our analysis on how violent extremist actors, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, a few others, have tried or took advantage of the pandemic. I think we already heard some of the examples. I mean, the increased use or increased spread of false information, conspiracy theories, and hate campaigns using social media, enhanced use of narratives aimed to increase distrust in the government or communities, and to build, on the other hand, a positive image of the groups or their groups. Use of the pandemic as a pretext to set up online fundraising campaigns. We saw some examples of that. Increasing use of cryptocurrencies in the financing of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, as a result actually of the closed borders, making it more difficult for international travel of cash couriers. And we also saw some examples of COVID-19 medical equipment sale of that for terrorism financing purposes. It's just a few examples. But I'll say specifically for violent extremism, despite the difficulties to ascertain the correlation between the pandemic and our analysis on the fluctuation of the terrorist activity, notably in those areas that I talked about, we have noted an increase of attacks by groups located in the sub-Saharan Africa and affiliated to Al-Qaeda and ISIL. And we saw also the same trend identified in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic. However, I would also say, although we can affirm with a high level of certainty that these groups have definitely exploited COVID-19 in their messaging and the work, on the other hand, it remains difficult to determine whether increased violence stems from existing trends, shift in terrorist or counter-terrorism approaches due to the pandemic, or both. So I'll say for the time being, at least based on our research, I mean, the most relevant trend and impact relates to the use of COVID-19 as a pretext to achieve the strategic objectives more than the use of the illness as a weapon per se. In fact, some, let's say, still early assessment highlights that the group's all strategic objectives, radicalization, incitement, recruitment, fundraising, etc., of course, not only remain the same, but has been further reinforced during the pandemic. And the key radicalization factors are exacerbated by the feelings of uncertainty, anxiety, lack of purpose, and social isolation. So bring me back to my original message, and I will stop in a second, and namely importance of engaging and empowering youth in efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism in this region, also during the pandemic. I mean, young people can still be the drivers of change among their peers, as well as among the communities, especially if their fragile socioeconomic situation is strengthened through the provision, support of new opportunities and responsibilities. I mean, defeating terrorists will not be enough if their presence has led to the normalization of violence among youth. So mitigating the long-term impact that the presence of terrorism has produced represent one of the biggest challenges, I think, for some of the countries of this region and its national partners in order to contribute to the development of more stable, more peaceful contexts with which this new generation can build their future. I think I better stop here. Already talked enough, so thanks a lot, and back to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Lief. No, I think your presentation follows quite well from Jennifer's. I think what we've heard from all speakers is both the pretext and the reality of why civic space closes, who is occupying some of these spaces. I think we also heard from you and also from others, not only the role of the state, but also the role of non-state actors, what has been going on. Really appreciate it. I think your focus on youth. I think this raises a question of who has become particularly vulnerable, more vulnerable, who is vulnerable because of the pandemic. But I also appreciated the focus on, some of this stuff isn't new. Root causes in some of these locations that you mentioned, Sahel, Lake Chad, etc. Root causes are root causes. They go back quite a long time, exacerbated by COVID. Now the question becomes, what do we do after the COVID pandemic eases a little bit, and you're still left with the root causes, which may now become a little bit worse for some particular communities, processes, etc. More radicalization, more violent extremism, less space to operate it. So very much appreciating that as well. Very quickly going to Chris Mahoney, who is the CEO of Peloria. We'll hear from him, and then maybe I'll go back to the panelists with some of these four questions that we have already received, and have a bit of an exchange after that. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to IDLO, to DESA, and to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for hosting and inviting me to be a part of this great panel. I feel like we've already received so much from my fellow panelists, but really just to hit a couple of key points first that I think our own observations are consistent with, which is one, the prioritization of the digital space, but at the same, on the behalf of government, something Sam mentioned in his opening remarks, but at the same time, a focus on the integrity of the evidence upon which we base our interventions, right? Either our preventive interventions or our responses to ongoing episodes of instability. And of course, our own approach at Peloria, which is a company that effectively develops models that draw on data representing real phenomena in society, as well as online language data and other language data across online news, social media, other sources, attribute sentiment about sensitive topics to that data, and effectively develop models to forecast change in social phenomena like violence, like levels of poverty, like sentiment about sensitive issues in specific territories over different look-ahead periods. But more importantly, I think to this discussion is the point made by our colleagues, which is how can governments respond? We have these anecdotal observations, as our colleague from Afghanistan noted, about the impact of COVID-19 on pre-existing stresses in a society. And then we have this governance gap that our colleague, Ms. Lockhart, identified, that is in effect informed by a data gap, right, by an evidence gap. And that also informs where, like, even across different sectoral interventions, how we prioritize, for example, the issues that we might deploy legal aid resources in support of. So right across the peace and development nexus of potential thematic interventions, there is this data gap. And that's in effect what we attempt to fill, and that comes out of my own experience working both in the World Bank and at UNDP. Fortunately for me, with colleagues like Sam and Georgia, including on the Pathways for Peace report that identifies the compounding nature of all these different dimensions of risk. So pre-existing sort of permanent macro risks, whether they be demographic, environmental, economic, social deficits in built infrastructure as examples, and how they interact with exogenous shocks like an armed group entering a territory, like a macro physical shock to commodity prices or to the broader global economy, or of course natural disasters. And that's really where areas such as risk finance and the peace and development community have to some extent been unable to merge their existing capacities, in large part because of these data gaps, right? Because there are so many phenomena associated with change in human behavior, and it's not just the real phenomena, it's the perceptions of those phenomena. But there's been this historical dearth in our capacity to observe, let alone accurately measure how perceptions change over time. Of course, we engage in surveys, but they only give you a snapshot in time in a particular locations. Whereas now, with the vast quantities of online language data, we're able to complement that increasing volume of data representing real phenomena. And what we're able to do, for example, in Kenya, where we're able to predict over 7-day look-ahead periods, 30-day look-ahead periods, over 7 other look-ahead periods, all the way through to 120 days with 89% accuracy, increases and decreases in violence, because we were able to draw on data representing phenomena from the economy, from demography, representing different climate phenomena, ecological phenomena, crop phenomena, associated commodity prices, but then also online language about all those things. So one of the things that Pathways for Peace report identified was this common gap between what we call objective horizontal inequality, the extent to which social groups are excluded from access to health and other public services, access to political participation, land and resources, justice and security, particularly pertinent here under the SDG 16 rubric. But even more important was the extent to which social groups perceive they are excluded from those things. And the two don't always line up. So to really be able to understand the dynamic relationship of how all these factors in reality and perceptions of them compound over time, we need to be able to draw on these most sophisticated artificial intelligence methods that we at Peloria, our chief data scientist, was formerly chief data scientist at the United States Institute of Peace, and is engaged with entities such as DARPA and others historically, alongside multiple disciplines. Because of course, if we just have that technical expertise in the data science, they then proceed with their own biases and their own assumptions about the world that aren't necessarily informed by that context-specific expertise that one needs across disciplines: history, political science, anthropology, sociology, environmental science, development, economics, security studies, as examples, right? So that can feed that data selection, what phenomena is most associated in a society. And we've had such a fantastic presentation of the phenomena that are observed by our colleagues, but then what data actually really represents that phenomena? How is it measured? Then how is it curated? And then how can all that social science expertise inform that the design of those data science experiments, so that we actually are able to achieve not just predictions, but what we call explainable AI, so that we can identify not just the historical factors associated with, for example, change in levels of violence in Mindanao, where we're working, the Bangsamoro region, in the Great Lakes region, for example, in the Sahel. Now we're about to start doing models for US cities, but also the change in configuration, the dynamic change of configuration in real factors and perceptions of those factors contemporaneously and associated with predicted change, whether it's in different forms of social unrest or violence, levels of poverty, or even negative sentiment about factors that is also associated with change in those and that other social phenomena. So I think this is where we foresee the significant opportunity going forward to fill this governance gap and this data gap that my fellow colleague, Ms. Lockhart, referred to, and start to better inform what kind of development activities are prioritized, at what scale, where, with what collaborators, over what timeline, and how those interventions are communicated about, using what language, across what mediums. One other thing we've been able to do, for example, in Kenya, is to identify the specific phraseology using what we call word embedding methods, which, instead of attributing sentiment to an entire sentence, treats each individual word as its own piece of code. So we can identify the language configurations most associated with decline in violence and increase in violence, right? So we can promote that language. And what we found there is, and it will come as no surprise to so many participating on this in this panel, whether as panelists or observers, that language surrounding women's rights, more equal access to public services, is most associated with decline in levels of violence. Do we know that that's causal? Perhaps not. We, as social scientists, we all know that we may be observing lurking variables that are enabling both that kind of discourse as well as decline in levels of violence. But at least we're at that point where we're starting to be able to explore and better understand the dynamic combinations, bidirectional, multidirectional, relationships between all these phenomena in society. Thanks also to IDLO, who provided us or who promoted a video which is on this conference website. If you go to the resources section, you can see a very short 2-minute explainer of what we do, how and to some extent how we do it. But my final point, Sam, I know we're probably running short on time here, is really just to also identify how this greater evidence-based approach can also drive SDG 16, which effectively we replicate. Certainly SDG 16 didn't take any notice of us when developing their own language. But Peloria's mission also is to bring together government, the private sector, and civil society around evidence-based approaches to inclusive, just, and resilient societies. So as we develop a more rigorous evidence base, that also closes the door to some extent on whether it's private sector, government, or even civil society actors that have their own vested interests in attempting to explain changes in levels of violence in narrow ways that aren't evidence-based, and in fact can drive greater levels of insecurity themselves. For example, in Chennai, where we're developing a model that forecasts not just social unrest, but social unrest related disruption of road and rail all around the port, that data can be anonymized, aggregated so as not to compromise privacy rights and other issues, and shared not just with those private sector partners, but also with civil society, so that civil society and the private sector can go together to government and say, look, we want the risk of this disruption to be driven down over the medium to long term, so we can continue to invest over the medium to long term in conducting our business in this city. This is what you have to respond to. These are the configurations historically. This is what we're seeing contemporaneously, that you can prioritize on your own budgetary processes and implementation in order to address these things for that key SDG 16 outcome, which is inclusive, just, and sustainably resilient societies. I hand back to you, Sam. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Chris. I mean, it's incredible how we've come full circle from where Shahrazad began as well, which is when she mentioned about the public health impact. If you don't actually have the data, then I think it's very difficult. We've gone through data integrity, transparency, who owns it, who has it, are there competing sets of data? And I think we got to your point, Chris, where if everybody's on the same page as far as data is concerned, then maybe an integrated approach is actually useful along the lines that everybody has a mandate to do. I think one of the questions that you also started to answer in the Q&A is about the role of civil society organizations, whether they are the ones that now find themselves responding to public health crises, or whether they are the ones who in a growing community have been part of the peace and conflict civil society organizations. Are they the small ones? Are they the big ones? How do we continue to support them as sort of this set of entities that help promote, I think, the social contract, social compact, as Claire mentioned, the vertical part, as well as the in-between people, horizontal part. You reminded me of a lot of really interesting work, I think, related to the risk-informed development. What does that mean at this point? I think a number of panelists effectively spoke about the need to further elaborate what we mean by having a standard talking point that is the need to work through institution-based and people-centered approaches. Are these complementary in particular ways? Does one come at the expense of another? And I think a number of the participants, the panelists, also spoke about, what is it? What is the meaning of resilience now, and resilience of who and what? I think institutions being crushed by the pandemic raises a question about how resilient to shocks are our institutions. Are those at national level, or are the ones at local levels doing better? And then the resilience of individuals and communities, very clear in Liaf's perspective, which is the resilience of youth is at risk for particular reasons, and we need to figure out a way to address that. We got ahead of the panel from the registrants. We got 4 questions, which I'll mention very quickly, and then go back to the panelists to elaborate on this. I'll start with Shahrazad, knowing that she needs to leave maybe in about 4 or 5 minutes. The first from Tabitha from Covenant Mediators and Counseling Center in Kenya. What is the role that stakeholders like mediation training institutions and trainers, what role can they play in ensuring peace and conflict resolution? Some of this is a little bit beyond the COVID-19 discussion, but everything for the last year or so is covered, is colored by COVID, obviously. The second question from Elizabeth Pappy, EU delegation to the UN. Hello, Elizabeth, if you're online. How can we ensure that conflict sensitivity is systematically built into processes? I think the conflict sensitivity, do no harm question has come up significantly in relation to COVID, and crisis and peace and conflict processes as well, whether that's an inclusion question like we heard from Shahrazad, or other sets of questions as well. We also got a question from Daniel Mack, Pathfinders. How should we define peace and conflict in a manner to include the vast majority of people who suffer and experience violence worldwide? I think for the past few years, and I think you see this from your own data, certainly UNICRI data. I think what Jennifer mentioned about, violence now and the institutions that deal with them as well, and Claire too. How does the peace and conflict community address new forms of violence? We don't talk so much about the Northern Triangle being the most violent in the world, Latin America and the Caribbean, per population standards. Criminality, I think, was mentioned on a number of occasions today. Organized crime mentioned on a number of occasions today. A good bit of this has flourished under COVID. The last questions from Habib Mayar, G7 Plus Secretariat. How can we use the pandemic to raise awareness for addressing conflict? What is the energy now, because maybe of COVID, that we can do more on addressing conflict and peace issues? And are there any lessons that can help in pursuing solidarity? Solidarity, I think, we've heard in other pseudonyms for this, like social cohesion, social protection, maybe, et cetera, et cetera. So Shahrazad, back to you. Reflecting on maybe some of these questions, but also reflecting on some of the things that came out in the panel, and any concluding thoughts from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Sam. I first want to thank all the panelists and yourself. I really learned a lot from this discussion. Very interesting to explore all aspects of this issue and the impact. As Claire said, I think we are yet to fully comprehend the impact of COVID-19 on all aspects of life. I mean, the questions are really great, but difficult questions. I think just speaking in terms of a little bit in terms of kind of conflict sensitivity, how do we make our systems more sensitive in light of the COVID-19? Also, the systems and the programs that are set up to deal with issues around peace and conflict. I think it was very important for us here in Afghanistan. It was a very important reminder of the multiple levels of obstacles to access and to inclusivity, as I spoke before. When we discussed, for instance, when the lockdown was announced and there was this assumption that people would work from home, it was really a reminder about to what extent the Afghan government employees particularly, and the Afghan government system is not digital. And so because it's not fully digital yet, many sectors, there were more obstacles to access to many of those sectors, as Jennifer was speaking about, for instance, the justice sector. When you have a system where everything depends on face-to-face interactions and people showing up and discussing things face-to-face, how do you deal with issues of access to justice when there is a lockdown imposed? We were really unprepared. And a lot of other government institutions, those who are prepared, for education was another example. We really, basically in the period of the lockdown, majority of Afghan students were deprived of their right to education because we don't have the infrastructure in place for, well, electricity, then internet, then computers. So how can people, you know, how can these children get educated when their parents are not familiar with computers? They can't afford computers, they can't afford smartphones, they don't have electricity at home. And so in many different sectors, and access to basic rights was really hugely impacted by COVID-19. And we became more aware of the fact that the ruler and the poor, their levels of exclusion really multiplied. One of the ways in Afghanistan that people can sometimes get hurt and try to have an impact and have their voice heard is through media. But of course, because of COVID-19 and because of limitations on travel, because of lockdown, even media were not accessible. The journalists were not traveling. People were not going out there to rural communities, have their voices recorded and linked and brought into the public debate. So I think that required some creativity. Some organizations really tried to adjust in this environment and come up with more creative ways and engage communities and use it as an opportunity to take skills or expand access to the digital space. But because of the particular situation here in Afghanistan, it still remains really limited. I'll stop there. I have to run to another meeting. I apologize that I can't stay longer. That was great being part of this discussion.
Thank you very much for Shahrazad for joining us. Very much appreciating your comments earlier, and especially these. And I think you brought about this idea that, you know, in many cases, COVID-19 is sort of the great equalizer. Access to education and the digital sphere, etc., reminded me of what was happening maybe earlier in the pandemic in March, April, May of last year here in New York City, not so far away, and then all countries in between. I think who became left behind, who became the most vulnerable, I think became also quite clear. Moving quickly to Claire, also in addition to some of these questions, when Chris presented, he linked also the governance gap to the digital gap. And I think there are a lot of really interesting links there that also relate to institutions and their strength and capacity, not least of which obviously the access issue. Let me go to you very quickly for a reflection on some of these questions and maybe some of what has come up as well.
Thank you. I'll respond to a couple of the questions and then some of the general themes. I think, you know, on the question from David from Pathfinders on how do we ensure that the categorization doesn't exclude those affected by violence and conflict in countries that may not be on some of the lists of fragility and conflict that we're used to. I do think it's important to revisit the way that taxonomies are built and created and maintained, especially with changing dynamics. In the process we've used at the State of the State, we had a very simple taxonomy of advanced countries, middle income countries, and then low income and conflict affected. But of course, there are pockets of violence and fragility in the advanced world and in middle income countries. So I think a revisiting of that taxonomies is overdue and absolutely to the point that, you know, the Northern Triangle is one example of a set of countries that need and deserve urgent attention, but are not don't always receive the attention in these kind of fora. On the how to build in the conflict sensitivity, I think the development and peace building community has come a long way in seeking to apply political economy analysis and so on. But I think the community has further to go, because often that political economy analysis, I think, is grounded more in the elites and the capital city than in truly understanding the social and economic dynamics across the country in rural areas as well as urban areas. So first is an understanding of context, understanding of the second and third order consequences of programming, and then the ability to adapt and monitor. Sam, to your point on the trade, is there a trade-off between the institutional approach and the people approach? And I think that's a really excellent question. And the two domains can be kept separate, but how to bring a people-centered approach into institutions. And I think at this time as well, I think there's been a worldwide appreciation for the role of people, of the individual civil servants who show up to work or on the front lines of delivery. But connecting it also to the youth point, I remember once a very senior UN diplomat saying at the time when the Arab Spring broke out, and when he was saying that people say, what can we do? And a gentleman in his 70s or 80s said, what we can do is get out of the way. There's a new generation. It's their turn to lead and manage. And so I think connecting how do in the public services and in leadership positions, people create way for the next generation and empower them to lead and make decisions, whether it's in national, local government, in business and in civil society. And then to Habib's point on solidarity, I think there's already so much, but could be so much more of learning across contexts, whether it's the experiences of what Sierra Leone and Liberia and Timor-Leste have been able to accomplish, and how they can share lessons with those who are seeking to resolve conflicts, and so on. And then finally, yes, on the measurement point, we've also been seeking to see how, what are the ways to measure the governance gap, and looking both at the objective, what is it that the international community measures, how governments assess themselves, and then what's the citizen perception of the legitimacy of institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Very clear, and thanks for pointing out a few important things. Maybe I go to Jennifer also for the same set of questions, but also in relation to the institution-based and people-centered. I think there's no place better than the justice or the criminal justice system, where institutions are populated for people, by people, to help people. And any kind of deviation in that, I think, causes a lot of the systematic issues. I appreciate when Liaf mentioned, some of the root causes of radicalization and extremism. Our own research from Journey to Extremism basically points out that one of the primary drivers for radicalization and joining and recruitment has been failures in the justice system, in the police system, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's important to recognize that. But going to you, Jennifer, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I completely agree. And it's one of the issues that we're looking at with our team in Tunisia, right, is the extent to which young people in particular are being radicalized in prison. And I think that a lot of this is driven from this sense of injustice. The fact that you have not been represented by counsel, your trial was in one day, you didn't have your voice heard, you didn't have the right to present a defense, there was no fairness built into, a perceived fairness built into the system. I think this also goes to the data issue that Chris pointed out. One of the things that we're really trying to drive forward is that justice can be measured. And we all know that this conversation came up during the SDGs when they were adopted. Can justice be measured? I don't think it's been measured well to date. We participated in a global study on legal aid that UNDP and UNODC drove forward a few years back. And one of the things we found is that in no country in the world is there much data on justice. And so one of the things we're really trying to drive forward is that, yes, justice, fair trial standards can be measured. You can measure, what legal aid providers are doing, the impact of that provision on not only the outcome of criminal cases, but more broadly, justice, reduction of violence in communities, and perceptions of justice, which really gets to this idea of people having trust and confidence in their criminal justice systems. But to your point, Sam, absolutely, we do not think these things are mutually exclusive. And in fact, we need institutions to provide legal aid services, right? People have a constitutional obligation. They have a human right to access to legal aid if they're suspected or charged with a crime. That means the state has to fund it. And then in most countries, they are not funding it. And they're certainly not funding it at any quality. And many of them think it's dispensable, right? It's not at the same level of police, prosecutors, judges. Oftentimes when we go to countries to talk about this issue, they'll say, well, we don't have enough money to fund legal aid providers. But they're not talking about not having enough money to fund police or prosecution systems or courts. And just a side note, I did work, I was a public defender, a legal aid lawyer. And in one jurisdiction in which I worked at one point, and this issue is not an issue just for conflict affected countries. The United States faces its own crisis and access to legal aid. But one of the jurisdictions I worked, when the lawyers went on strike because the government was not paying them effectively to do the work, the court said, okay, well, we're going to release everybody because they have a right not to be held past a certain period of time without access to a lawyer. Once they did that, the government found the money very quickly. So I think that there needs to be kind of this understanding of, this is what the law says. If they're not getting someone, this is what's going to happen. And then governments will step up and stand up for this right. I just want to go to that. There was a great question on mediation, and just to go back to Sam, your reference to restorative justice, which is really what we're talking about. And I think that this is something that comes from many indigenous communities, this idea around before formal justice systems really became part of the colonial movement around the world and establishing these court systems and prosecution systems. There was this idea of community-based justice. And I think what we're really trying to get back to in many of the justice systems in which we work with our partners is how can we use existing mechanisms like mediation or evolve mechanisms to really address the harm that communities feel and more effectively address those harms outside of a justice system, which isn't really addressing the victim's needs, right? And isn't addressing the offender's needs. And one of the areas we talk about this, just to go back to in Afghanistan, the issue of violence in communities. If you're locking up an alleged offender, they're not going to come out any less predisposed to violence. And so it's really about getting at those root causes, understanding the harms, understanding the drivers and the pathways into violence so that we can fully address them.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Very, very, very clear. So in the next 7 minutes, to split 3.5 minutes between our last two presenters, let me ask Lief a question from left field. You've heard these questions, but from your perspective, and especially given the financing crunch because of COVID, where we understand that some of the resources have gone to the pandemic response, and maybe less for humanitarian, political, peace, etc. Responses. From the perspective that you're seeing, particularly on criminality, crime, prevention of violent extremism, radicalization issue, if you look forward, is it a question, is what is missing a funding question, a financing question, or broadly speaking, a resourcing question? Because it would seem that a lot of the work, I think, that is either being referenced in what we said and in the questions is about good accompaniment, human resources to be able to support not only our resources, but supporting national capacities to be able to accompany. That is slightly different from institution support, but having good human resources that enable, anti-radicalization, preventing violent extremism, the role of local leaders, etc. What kinds of things are you seeing in sort of the needs that are coming up, and therefore the response as well? Leaving about 3 minutes to Chris to also answer and maybe comment briefly. Over to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Sam. 2.5 minutes, I think I left now. Well, Very good question. I would say in general, and it goes actually back to the question number 2, I think it was, how to build it into the programming processes, which have different levels. And of course, also touch upon, I think, the question that you ask now. I mean, what we could see from our latest report, what enhances community resilience to radicalization into violent extremism, touched upon many of these issues, but I think you also mentioned, at least it has 3 elements. I mean, the first one, which you mentioned, is the structural element. The state governments need to lead the efforts to address the root causes, whether it's good governance, rule of law, criminal justice, etc., all that leading to radicalization into the violent extremism. And of course, that has to be done in collaboration and dialogue with community-based actors. Does it need resources? Does it need money? Does it need a push from our side? Good question. The second one is, I think any solution, and I also mentioned that in my intervention, I think, any solution has to be informed by a sound knowledge of local and wider political, economic, social, and cultural dynamics. Does that need resources? Does that need human resources? Does it need a push from our side or from the international community? I think it's all a combination. And the third one, which of course is to a certain degree a resource issue as well, I think we know that, is the solutions, or at least our recommendation, have to be designed as a long-term processes, going back to both 1 and 2, geared towards the building more inclusive and tolerant societies. And I think in principle, all 3 has to be addressed, at least in our programs and the program processes that we are discussing. And whether that is a research issue or human resource issue is a bit difficult to really to answer. But of course, what we are doing and what UNICRI is doing and many agencies are doing, of course, is trying to address all 3 issues. But what we are doing in particular in this region, of course, is to approach this issue in preventing, countering radicalization, relying heavily, and I think I mentioned it many times, of course, on the civil society, non-state actors, their local knowledge to address, to identify the problems at the community levels, and the ability to tailor, to craft, let's say, tailor-made solutions, or at least recommendations. And I think this participatory approach and local solution probably, of course, we all know, have a longer term impact than solutions coming from the outside the community. So that's the way, of course, we are working. It will require resources. It will require more resources also in the future, but I think it's also a human resource issue as well. That was in 3 minutes, not easy, but.
Thanks so much. Perfect. In the last 2 minutes, Chris, you can say whatever you like. But if you look at 2030, and we can together envision a peaceful, cohesive, just, resilient society, so to speak, do you have a data pathway for the next 9 years to get there, given all of the challenges about integrity of data, access, et cetera, and everybody else that's using data for other purposes as well? Over to you. You're on mute. We'll give you another 10 seconds.
Yeah, grateful. A very difficult question because there's so much catch up on the part of regulators, of governments, in terms of controlling what data providers, those that design algorithms that forecast and explain and then advise upon interventions in regard to fragility do and don't do. Right? When we're developing this kind of capacity, where we can literally identify language associated with increase in violence and language associated with decrease in violence, we don't provide to clients that language associated with increase. That is just a constraint that we put on ourselves, one of very many, and we're working with leaders in this field to try to hypothesize and understand what are the foreseen and the unforeseen consequences of what we're able to do, because there's significant risk associated with this kind of capacity. At the same time, there's so much opportunity, not just for building this kind of dynamic data that better captures the totality of all phenomena, rather than us sitting in our development economics or environmental science or justice silos and rightly identifying the relationship of what we do to change in levels of violence, but also being able to understand first the dynamic relationships of all these factors and how they're perceived to inform, to be systematically incorporated into the development of what we select to do, and then how we iterate it in response to the changing configuration of factors associated with violence. But there's one, I'm probably running out of time here. There's one final point. I think that that hasn't necessarily been foreseen by those of us in the development or peace and security community, which is we're in the strongest position to best interrogate and therefore evidence the relationship between these factors and change in more inclusive, just and resilient societies. That also positions us to bring along with us. So when we're engaged by hedge funds or financial services industry about, oh, okay, if you can predict this social phenomena, what's it related to what we do? Then we're also in the best position to vet what they're asserting about environmental and social and governance approaches to investment. You know, I mean, you can politely say that I think in financial services industry, the approach to this area of investing is quite superficial, right? And how they actually evidence and measure, you know, what they decide to invest into and what they don't, right? But there's this enormous growth here. And this is where I think we can think outside of our own area of practice in order to bring them not only along with us and what they invest in, but also along with us, civil society and government, you know, to compel that kind of investment, the kind of resource allocation that our other colleagues on the panel, you know, were identifying as too scarce, because they'll be able to see their own interest in advancing that kind of investment for medium and long-term growth of all of what they're investing into. Sorry, I probably went over time. So, thanks.
No worries. Thank you so much, and thanks for also shedding light on a blind spot that I think we should have caught earlier as well, which is the link to the private sector and the financing part. But this may be subject of another session as well. We're pretty much on time. Very much appreciating all of your inputs, everybody that joined online and streaming service. And again, thanks very much to the government of Italy, UNDESA, and IDLO for the invitation to be part of this fascinating panel, and looking forward to many more engagements. Have a good morning, evening, afternoon to everyone. And thanks very much to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next time. Thank you, everybody.